2 Corinthians chapter 3. In the first 3 verses, let's read. He says, "Are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on our hearts, to be known and read by all. And you show that you are a letter from Christ, delivered by us, written not with ink, with the Spirit of the living God, but not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts." You know, as I read this, I kind of almost wonder if at the heart of this little snippet is a prelude of when you get on into 2 Corinthians and Paul having to kind of say, here I am, and this is who I am, because of those false apostles that were trying in some way to discredit him. And so he begins, do we need to commend ourselves again to you? Do we need letters of recommendation? Now sometimes today we might say a letter of reference. And actually this was not an uncommon thing in the first century. You know, traveling wasn't quite with the ease that we have it. Nor do you can't go in the first century and look up somebody on Facebook to kind of see what kind of people are these folks. You couldn't Google him. And so how do we know what kind of fellow this is? So sometimes people would bring literally a letter of recommendation. And he's kind of saying, you know, do we really need this? A letter of recommendation? He says in verse 2, you yourselves are our letter of recommendation. You yourselves. You see, he had already been there. He's already written to them 2 or 3 times by the time you get to 2 Corinthians. And so they themselves should be the letter of recommendation. They're the ones who should know. This is the Apostle Paul. But then he goes on to say, written on our hearts. You're the letter of recommendation. You're on our hearts. I think what he's saying is that, brothers, I love you. And that should mean something to you. But then he gets down to verse 3 and he says, and you show that you are a letter from Christ. And I think this is real interesting. You are a letter from Christ. You know, how did you come to know truth? Well, I opened up my Bible and I read. He says, you, Corinthians, are the letter of truth. The letter from Christ. Years ago I heard a statement. You've probably heard it too. You may be the only Bible that some people ever read. And that's kind of what this is. Your lives, you are the letter from Christ. Oh, by the way, if we were to make the statement about you, you are the letter from Christ. When people read your lives, what do they learn about Jesus? When they read your lives, what do they learn about the Christ? When they read your lives, what do they learn about the truth? And then that last phrase in this paragraph, he said, tables of human hearts. Is God's Word written on your heart? Beginning in verse 4. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God. The word pride is not found in these 2 verses. The word humility is not found in these 2 verses. But both those words, the meanings, are certainly there. You know, this is written from the standpoint of someone who has humbled themselves before God and say, I can't do it myself. I need you, God. I need you. You see, the only confidence that he says, we have confidence. But it's through Christ toward God. Not that we have sufficiency in ourselves to claim anything. It's not me. Okay, this morning we're not going to tonight talk about our sin so much, but it is just this way. We've all sinned. We've fallen short. No matter how good you can stack the righteousness, there's still that sin against us. You know, as you read verse 4, verse 5, verse 6, I don't see the word grace in there, but I see the word grace written all over these 3 verses. In other words, it's not you. You weren't good enough. You couldn't do it yourself. You have confidence through Christ toward God. You can't claim anything from yourself. Your sufficiency, it's from God. It's got grace written all over it, doesn't it? Because there wouldn't be this without grace. And then in verse 6, he kind of then moves almost to I hesitate just to say a different subject, but he does then move to a subject of the covenants. Verse 6, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, the reason I mentioned moves to kind of a subject of covenants is you've got new covenant mentioned here in chapter 3, verse 5. You go over to chapter 3, verse 14, and you find mention made of the old covenant. Now, it's just the case that if you pick up your Bible and you've never seen it before, well, I tell you what I do with a book I've never seen before. I look at the table of contents, because often the table of contents can tell you something about what's in that book. Well, you do that with the Bible, and you're going to see, Old Testament's got all these things listed under the Old Testament. And then I see this section called New Testament, and I see all these things listed. If you were to read it, you get to a point about 3/4 of the way through, and you find a big break, and it says New Testament. Well, it's fair for a person to say, what's the difference? Is there a difference? Is there a significance of one in contrast to the other? And here in this little section, he lets us know some things about this New Testament, this Old Testament. Now, when you get on into this verse 6, he says, New covenant. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, sometimes people will talk about the letter of, maybe they're saying the letter of the law or the spirit of the law, and they're contrasting kind of somebody just keeping it at almost a legalistic fashion to, well, what's the real meaning of it? I don't think at all that's what he's speaking of here. Because he says, New covenant. This new covenant is not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Why, if we were talking about of the letter kind of legalistically, or spirit, kind of spiritual meaning of it, somebody could maybe apply both those things to the New Testament. But he's saying, no, New covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. What he's doing here with the letter and Spirit, he's contrasting, I believe, the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant, as you find here mentioned in the New Covenant mentioned in verse 6, and the Old Covenant mentioned in verse 14. And then he says the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. We might say, wait. The Old Testament kills. Well, it's interesting. In Romans chapter 7, verse 12, you find that the law, speaking of the old law, is holy, righteous, and good. And somebody might say, well, wait, holy, righteous, and good, how could it be that the letter kills? Well, I think when he says holy, righteous, and good, he's speaking and describing the origin and purpose of the old law. But when you go to Romans chapter 8, verse 2, again, you're still in the same context, Romans 7, Romans 8. He speaks of the law of sin and death. Speaking of that same law that he had just described as holy, righteous, and good. And so how is it now a law of sin and death? Now he's speaking from the standpoint, not from its origin and purpose, but the standpoint of efficacy. In other words, for the Old Testament to truly give life, no, because we've sinned and there's not adequate sacrifice in the Old Testament to give us that life. But this new law, this law of the Spirit, last three words of verse 6, it gives life. And now there's a discussion, kind of, and a contrast between the old and new. Look at verse 7. For if the ministry of death, carved in letters of stone, oh, by the way, this ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, why, he's speaking of that Old Testament. In fact, those 10 Commandments given to Moses. He says they came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze on Moses' face because of the glory. And he speaks down here, these next few verses, of glory and then kind of a veil. And if you go back to Exodus chapter 34, verses 29 to 35, you can read an occasion where, Moses comes out and his face is shining so they can't really look on him, so he veils it. And then he goes back in, he talks to God, he takes it off. Then he goes back out and he doesn't have it, so once again, the glory, and he has to put it back on. And so he's kind of bringing to mind this aspect of Moses and the giving of the law. And so he goes on, he says, the Israelites could not gaze on Moses' face because of its glory, which was brought to an end. Here you find also this is brought to an end. Verse 11, for if what was being brought to an end. In other words, this old law, this law that Moses gave, was going to come to a point that is brought to an end. King James Version says done away in verse 11. So here we're getting this sense. This old law, this letter, it's going to eventually come to an end. He says, verse 8, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? In other words, there's such glory that Moses had to hide his face. Well, surely that ministry of the Spirit have more glory. In verse 9, for if there was glory in the ministration of condemnation, the ministration of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all. He's contrasting that old covenant with the new covenant. That he contrasted the letter with the Spirit. He's contrasting what Moses gave to what Jesus has given. Verse 10, indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. See, we're contrasting old and new. Aren't we blessed? I think you'd have to kind of walk away from this. Aren't we blessed to live under that New Testament law of Christ? The glory that far surpassed that old. In verse 11 again, for if what was being brought to an end or done away came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. This New Testament. So glorious. And then verse 12, he's continuing along this same topic. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. There you find it, brought to an end. That's 3 times you read this phrase in these few verses. Verse 14, but their minds were hardened. And to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted because only through Christ it is taken away. Now, there's ways in which this section reminds me of Galatians 3, 23 through 25. Galatians 3, 23 through 25. And there it's speaking of the relationship of the old law to Jesus, to the new. And it says, "But before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned unto the coming faith would be revealed." Before faith, before Jesus, before the faith, that law of Christ, we were under the law. Imprisoned until the coming of faith, the faith, Christ. Verse 24, "So then the law was our guardian." Now the King James Version says schoolmaster. The word literally is boy leader. Guardian is better. And it would be used of a person who would conduct the child from his home to the school. That's why it'd almost be like today if we were said school bus driver. But the whole idea is that while that child is with the guardian, while he's, you might say, with a school bus driver, he is subject to that one. But then when he's delivered to the school, as it were, he's not now under the authority of that guardian, the school bus driver, but rather he's now under the authority of the one who's been delivered to. And he says here, law is our guardian until Christ, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. This and many other places speak of how we're not now under the Old Testament law of Christ, but under we're not now under the Old Testament law of Moses, but we are under the New Testament law of Christ. Verse 15 back in 2 Corinthians 3. "Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." In verse 18, if you were to take, literally, chapter 3 and say, okay, sermons from chapter 3, you'd find almost all those sermons coming from verse 18. And they probably got filed away in the preacher's file cabinet under spiritual growth. But here he says in verse 18, "And we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." Now I know just reading that, somebody might say, and so why so many sermons? Well, just consider. We now with unveiled face, we have that New Testament law of Christ. Beholding the glory of the Lord. Now the King James says beholding as in a glass. Most other translations, beholding as in a mirror. And this word beholding, kind of within the word itself, carries this idea of kind of in the glass or the mirror. And the mirror is really the better idea than glass. But I really like the fact that other translations mention the idea of mirror, because like I say, you look up the word and kind of built within the word is this idea of reflection. And so it's kind of like, well, I look into a mirror, do I see me? Or let me say this, do you look in the mirror and do you see Christ? Do you look into a mirror? Do you see just yourself or do you see Christ? Because he goes on to say, are being transformed into the same image. We're beholding the glory of the Lord. But it's like we're looking in a mirror. but we're beholding the glory of the Lord. How is that? And then he says we're transformed into the same image. The image, well, the glory of the Lord. It's just one degree of glory to another. It's like there's a growth here. So are we, looking at this, beholding the glory of the Lord and then being transformed into that same image? If somebody said, can I see Jesus in you? That's what he's talking about here. If you're asked, can I see Jesus in me? Can others see Jesus in me? That's what he's talking about here. Us being transformed, the image is the glory of the Lord. And by the way, it doesn't happen overnight. He says one degree of glory to another. The person who wants to grow and strives to grow is the one who is going to grow, okay? What I mean by that, if we were to say, okay, this fellow's been a Christian 50 years and he's never tried to grow, wanted to grow. Well, the guy that's been a Christian 1 year but wanted to grow and tried to grow, he may have surpassed the guy that's been a Christian 50 years. But all things being equal, two people, each wanting to grow, each striving to grow, each having the intention to grow, you'd think that the more time, the more effort, the greater spiritual growth he achieves. Well, okay, if I'm looking at myself, am I seeing the glory of the Lord? Am I seeing it progress? Am I seeing myself grow? Like I said, chapter 3, verse 18, I really think probably from chapter 3 more sermons had been preached on this one verse, and the preacher then files it away under spiritual growth. But that's chapter 3. If I were to kind of look back on it and say, what do I want to take away from this? Well, one would be that verse 3. Are you a letter? You are a letter from Christ. Can people read the Bible by seeing your life? I'd also kind of take away that verse 4 and 5. If I'm going to have this confidence and sufficiency, it's not in me. It's in Jesus. And I'd also take away that there's a contrast between the Old and the New Testament. We're under now that New Testament law of Christ. And then lastly, let's look at Jesus and grow and reflect Him in our lives. If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, this morning, this is afternoon. I'm confused. Not tonight, not this morning, this afternoon. If it's baptism or if it's a need for prayer,